particular midwife whose own struggles and challenges sort of represent a testament to the direction, the problems within women's health movement. Okay. In the first edition of Our Bodies Ourselves, the Boston Women's Health Book Collective asked, what are our bodies? First, they are us. We do not inhabit them, we are them. In 1970, this was a controversial claim, particularly among feminist theorists. Difference feminists, such as the authors of Our Bodies Ourselves, placed the female body at the center of their identity, whereas equality feminists, and I'm using these terms somewhat loosely, but there is a sort of an ideological divide between these two groups. So equality feminists sought to transcend that biological barrier by de-emphasizing the female body. I argue that this ideological divide had profound implications for women's health and feminism, and really for medicine more generally, in the late 20th century. Historically, claims of difference between men and women have been used to reinforce a gender hierarchy, thereby marginalizing women. Why then would some second-wave feminists turn to an essentialist argument of female biological difference to combat oppression, the same position previously used to combat, to subjugate women? Okay, so it seems somewhat counterintuitive that they would embrace what many saw as an essentialist argument. The key to understand this feminist paradox, as I'm calling it, lies in the historical relationship between scientific knowledge, women's bodies, and medical practice. In the late 19th century, a new paradigm of experimental science altered this relationship by privileging laboratory research over clinical observation. Supporters of the new laboratory science touted it as more rational, detached, and objective. Critics viewed it as flawed, challenging its claim of objectivity as impossible to achieve, and the desire to seek knowledge free of specific context as problematic. Many of these critics, which included female physician Elizabeth Blackwell, feared that this new modern scientific approach to medicine would lose sight of its subject, the patient. They believed that empathic expertise, based on a connection with and compassion for the patient, trumped a mechanistic scientific model. But they were outnumbered and overpowered by their adversaries. This historical moment provides an intellectual antecedent to the 1970s debates between feminists by establishing these binary oppositional approaches to science that were distinctly gendered. The new experimental science of the late 19th century dismissed empathy and nurturing as feminine and as bad science, replacing these approaches with objectivity and clinical detachment, which they saw as masculine. Nearly a century later, feminist philosophers returned to this historical moment to trace the trajectory of medicine and its disconnect from all things feminine. They sought to challenge the division between subject and object in medicine, and to introduce a different form of knowing based on subjective experience. In the process, they resuscitated and restructured essentialist claims of female difference. Evelyn Fox Keller, for example, proposed replacing static objectivity with what she termed dynamic objectivity, which, as she explains, is not unlike empathy, a form of knowledge of other persons that draws explicitly on the commonality of feelings and experience in order to enrich one's understanding of another in his or her own right. Such proposals suggested the possibility of destabilizing subjectivity and objectivity as oppositional theoretical models. Others, however, saw no need for restructuring earlier claims of difference, instead proposing that feminists embrace it wholeheartedly. Feminist poet Adrienne Rich declared, "We need to imagine a world in which every woman is the presiding genius of her own body." Rich, along with a growing number of difference feminists in the 1970s, struggled to position the female body at the center of women's liberation. Women would never attain equal status, they argued, without the authority and knowledge that came from their own bodies. Thinking through the body rather than around the body remained a neglected yet central component of female empowerment, they believed. Though patriarchal ideology and practice had sought to restrict women's claims to power by emphasizing biological difference, They believed that a new generation of women could come to view our physicality as a resource rather than a destiny. Rather than feeling trapped by the constraints of their bodies, women should embrace the corporeal ground of our intelligence. So in my book, I locate and link moments from that corporeal ground that offered the potential to empower and unify American women in the 1970s and 1980s. Building on the movements and activism of the 60s, women in the 1970s were in an ideal position to challenge conventional thinking about the female body. Not only should women have access to information about their bodies, they argued, they should also help to create this knowledge. In the context of women's bodies and women's health, the notion that the personal is political, that sex and reproduction lay at the root of women's oppression, carried great weight. Individual women's stories, whether from their first pelvic exam, their experience with birth control or abortion, or childbirth, and these are all things that I talk about in my book, took precedence as a legitimate aspect of knowledge construction. As one reader of the book, Our Bodies Ourselves, explained, I think the book helped me internalize the idea that lived experience is as important, if not more so, than clinical or scientific knowledge. Privileging individual experience over scientific analysis allowed for a more democratic, less hierarchical approach to learning about female biology, something potentially revolutionary. But this privileging of experience and the assumption that it provided incontestable evidence of a universal sisterhood ultimately, I argue, stymied women's health activism. For one thing, the assumption that female biology was a central concern for all women, regardless of class, race, politics, or sexual preference, became a contentious issue. Attempts at creating a universalist notion of shared oppression reflected a certain lack of sensitivity to different needs and perspectives. For another thing, feminist theorists cringed at what they believed to be the romanticization of female experience as something pure or innate. As a result, many feminists grew wary of talking about women's experience. They challenged the privileging of women's stories as being naive. And further, they argued that there was no authentic experience which could be divorced from the discourses that constructed it. Thus, while the women's health movement was still struggling to achieve recognition as a legitimate social movement, it was already being derailed in scholarship. By the second decade of women's health activism, in the age of feminism, new challenges and opportunities altered the playing field. Recognizing that they needed to earn a seat at the bargaining table in order to change the ways in which women's health was researched and regulated, activists developed recognized insider credentials as professionals by becoming doctors, consulting lobbyists, testifying in hearings, gaining certification to deliver babies, etc., those kinds of tasks. By doing so, however, they undermined their very notion of difference. They appropriated the language of scientists, turning to a more traditional type of expert, those whose credentials were listed after their names, rather than coming from any authentic experience as women. This process resulted in greater inclusion for women, both as researchers and as research subjects. But it also distanced these activists from their lay followers, who sometimes found their compromises or professional development to be indicative of selling out rather than furthering the cause of women's self-empowerment. This professionalization resulted in a mixed legacy for women's health. On the one hand, it allowed for greater recognition and potential impact within organized medicine, generating more legislation and regulation on women's health research and practice. On the other hand, it weakened the movement's ideological basis, albeit slippery to begin with, by undermining the notion that female authority and power was rooted in the biological body. Adrienne Rich's hope that every woman would become the presiding genius of her own body has only partially been successful. So that's my, I just threw my entire argument at you. Now I want to return to childbirth, get back into the stories themselves, and sort of apply what I've argued there to this example. What I found when doing research on childbirth, which I found so fascinating, I realized I wanted it to be an additional book. So that is now my new project as well. But what I found, from the stories that emerge from places like Ms. Magazine, Our Bodies Ourselves, explosion